In this video, I want to deal with a bad dataset where the dataset follows a format you might find in Excel, where you have one column with names, and then the user is supposed to fill out data inside the columns. In this case, we have 3 columns that correspond to this one skill, and the user is supposed to write an X in the first column if the person is bad at that skill, if they're alright at the skill in the second column, and if they're fantastic in the third column. This is essentially the case where this one column has been spread over 3 columns, and I want to combine these into one column. The first 2 solutions are kind of boring, and then in the third one we'll solve it in a fun way. I first want to solve the problem using transposing, and afterwards I'll solve it with a new column. As said, I first want to transpose my original data table. This allows me to use the fill down function in order to replace null with a value above. We can right click the column and say fill down. I can now transpose the table once more, which means in this first row I have the 3 column headers I need. I can now raise the headers, which will solve one problem, but it will give me another problem. In this case, I now have a repeating pattern, which is where the first part of the column header is correct, but then we have the underscore followed by a number. And it would be a lot easier if the format was always no suffix, underscore 1, then underscore 2, but it doesn't, it goes underscore 3 and underscore 4. So we'll need to deal with that. First, I'll manually solve the first column, because I know that's always going to be a name column. Next, I can use the function table.transform column names in order to transform all of my columns, except I don't want to transform the name column. I might also have multiple columns in an actual dataset that I want to remove. I want to sort those columns to skip in a variable. We'll start out by defining those variables. And this needs to be a list because I could have multiple columns to ignore. I then want to use transform column names, where I want to apply that to the previous step. And then my function is going to be each if the pattern for the naming convention is that in the first column for the skill I don't have the suffix, then I have underscore and a number, an underscore and a number plus 1. First I want to skip transforming the column names of the columns in my ignore columns variable with a simple if statement. My list to check is then the variable ignore columns, and my underscore then represents the current column header. So if this is the case, then I want to output the underscore. In other words, I don't want to change the name column. Otherwise, I want to do an actual transformation. I then want to deal with the first column for the new skill, which doesn't have a suffix. So I can say if text after delimiter, and the delimiter is then an underscore. If that is equal to blank, then I know that I don't have anything after that delimiter. Because if I use text.after delimiter on the word cleaning, well, there isn't a delimiter of the underscore, which means everything to the right is just null. And then if we convert that into text, that becomes an empty string. So if that is the case, I want to append the word bad, because the first column is always whether you're bad at the skill. And if not, then I need to check my second condition. Conveniently, the format is that the second column will always be an odd number and the third column will always be an even number, because it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, meaning I can use number.isOdd to do this check. And then I need to grab the text after delimiter, which I did up here. Meaning if the number after the delimiter is then odd, I know I'm in the second column, which means I need to append alright to the name. I also need to grab all the text before the last underscore. But I'm going to assume you don't have an underscore normally in the column header. And if we're not in the first column or the second column, we have to be in the third column, which means I don't have to do an if statement. You'd need to do that if you have 4 skill levels, but I don't. Meaning I can repeat the code up here, but I can append a different word at the end. And then I need to remember that actually in my column header, that is text, so I need to convert this into a text. Now we've changed the column headers and everything is alright. Which also means I no longer need this first row. I can go under the Home tab and say remove rows, remove top rows 1. I then want to unpivot based on my first column, because I have a lot of nulls here that I don't want. I know that for a given skill, even though I have 3 columns, there's only a value in one of the columns, otherwise there's a problem. I can then right click the name column and say unpivot other columns. And then I don't want to have the columns be named attribute and value. I can call them task and skill level. The next thing to deal with is having this X, which doesn't convey any value. I'd rather have this X be bad or alright or Superman, because that actually conveys information. Which means I then need to do a conditional replace, where I replace the value in the skill level column based on the value in the task column. I first want to use the replace values function just to get the syntax. I always find that a bit easier to deal with. And I'm going to be providing my own function, which means normally you put in the old value and then the new value, but I'm going to put in gibberish here because it doesn't actually matter. Because when you create a function that I'm going to create, it doesn't actually matter what the old value is. So I'm simply going to call it a space. My new value is then going to be a condition because I want to replace that x with a value based on the last word of the task column. Meaning my new value is actually going to be a condition, which is if text contains, I then want to access the task column and say if the task includes the word bad, then I want to replace the old value with a new value, and that new value is going to be bad. And just a little side note, you could also write in an X here, but in my real world scenario, I had people write an X or a capital X or a space or any other number of values. That's why I choose to ignore what the person actually wrote in the column. And I'm instead assuming that if there is text in the column, then that is correct. And I don't actually care what they wrote. To get back on track, we've now dealt with bad. I then need to deal with alright, and I can simply copy this code and change that to say instead if the text contains the word alright, then I want to output alright. Lastly, I do want to do a condition for my third situation rather than simply doing an else, because I want to make sure that if there is a mistake, I can more easily catch it. I'll say to output a 0 if neither of these three conditions are met. Like I said, I wanted to provide my own function rather than this replacer.replaceText function. So I need a comma at the end, and then my function is going to be, and this always follows the same syntax of current, old, new, where current is then the actual value in the column, and the old is this value, and the new is my condition. So my function is going to output a text, and it's going to go towards, and then I simply want to output the new, because as explained, I want to handle the situation that my user writes something other than a small x. And then I needed a comma. So that's actually everything we needed here. We do have one final thing to do, which is I want to clean up the task column, where I simply want to remove the bad, alright, and Superman. I can solve that almost by copying the same code. I have to solve that with another replace value step. And again, I'm going to input 1 and 0 because I like having the basic syntax. I find that easier to work with. Once more, I'm going to provide my own function, and this time I want to show that depending on what your function is, you can actually say that the new value and the old value are both empty, because I'm simply going to provide a function that fixes my column. And that function is going to be, again, it follows the same syntax of current, old, new. As text, you don't have to provide that, but I like it because then my column is already a text. My function is then going to be list accumulate, which is I want to do multiple transformations in one go. I want to remove these suffixes, meaning anytime I come across any of these three texts, I'm going to replace them with nothing. And I need to wrap this in a list constructor, and then that is a list I accumulate over. My seed is then the current value, and my function is then seed, current. And actually I want to call this current value instead, just because I can then use seed, current. And this then goes towards text replace. I want to grab the seed value, and then the old that I'm looking for is the current, which is then the value inside of my list, so the suffixes. And anytime I come across that current, I want to replace it with an empty string. In other words, I want to remove it. And now we get rid of this. So now we have a clean task column. And lastly, there's one other thing you can do. This is the format I prefer, where you have the name column, the task, and then the skill level. And you could then drag in the task column into a field and then do some calculation with the skill level. But you may also want another format where you have one column for each task. And we can get that by pivoting based on the task column, where the values aren't found in the name column, they're found in the skill level column. And I don't want to apply any aggregate function. This then gives us one column for each skill. So that was the first solution. In the second easy solution, I want to solve the problem by adding a new column which has the correct headers, which might be a bit simpler. I still want to start out by transposing my table, and I still want to use fill down to handle my tasks. And actually I only need to grab that first column because I want to deal with the headers first, meaning instead of grabbing the source table, I instead want to grab only the one column, column 1. I can use this double square bracket syntax in order to grab only one column. And this is the same as saying table.select columns and then saying column 1. Then I want to add in an index, which should start from -1, which will make sense in a moment. This is because I want to ignore that first column, and you may have multiple columns at the start that you want to ignore. I then want to add the new column, and it's going to be cramped if I do it inside this tiny box. So I'm just going to output a 1 and then I can change it. And this column is going to include my correct column names. I want to use the modulo function because again I have 3 columns for each skill. So I know if I use modulo 3 I get an output I can use because it has a predictable format. So I want to start out by defining a modulo variable, which is then the function modulo, which is to go into the index column. Actually I need to write the each before because we're now in the context of the current row. And because my pattern is 3 columns, I want to set the divisor at 3. So we now have the modulo. And the modulo is sort of like doing an integer division. So if we take the number 4, 4 modulo 3 is then the same as saying 4 divided by 3 is 1.33. Because if we do a full division of 4 divided by 3, well, we have to split that 4 into a 3 plus 1. Because 3 is divisible by 3 and gives a whole number. And then we have the remainder of 1, which is then the modulo. I can then say if my modulo is equal to 0, then I know I'm in the first column, because I wanted to ignore the first column. That's why I set the index to -1. And then the first column for each skill either has an index of 0 or a number divisible by 3. And in terms of modulo, apparently, if you say 0 divided by 3, that gives modulo 0. That's just a quirk of the math. But in any case, I then want to go and grab the value in column 1 and append the bad suffix. And this time I'll probably use text combine. And I need to wrap that in a list. And I then do the same condition, but now checking for 1 instead. I can say if modulo is equal to 2, then I want to write Superman. Actually at the start I want to say if the index is equal to -1, then I know I'm in the first column and I want to write name. And lastly I want to simply output error if something has happened. Yeah, now I have my correct column headers. I can then extract this one column by simply right clicking and saying remove other columns. And again, this is the same as that shortcut syntax that I showed here. I can then transpose this column. I can then combine this table with my previous table, but I have one problem here, which is that my dataset is in Danish, and when Power Query creates these new columns, it does it in English, which means I need to deal with that. And you probably don't have to deal with that if you're English, but I do. So I need to fix my column headers. So that is going to be, I want to use the transform column names function. And then my name generator is simply a replace, where I want to grab the underscore. And every time I find the word column, I want to replace it with the Danish word. And now that's fixed. Now I can combine my two tables, which is done with the table combine function, which takes a list. And this lets me specify that this table should be the first table. I can now raise headers, because I've now made sure that the first row contains the correct headers. So that is fine. And like before, I can now remove the first row, because I no longer need it. And actually no, I need to remove the first 2 rows. Then everything with this solution follows what I did previously. So we ended up with this situation. So I'm not going to bore you by repeating these steps.